today we're delighted to have Buckley Brinkman, who is Executive Director and CEO of the Wisconsin Center of Manufacturing and Productivity. And he is somebody who's been around industry for a number of years and has a lot of wisdom. Buckley, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Karen. It's my pleasure.
Buckley, give us a little bit of a thumbnail on your background and a little bit of history on the center.
Sure. I'm grew up here in Madison, Wisconsin, so I'm north of the Cheddar Line here. And after going to school, was out of the state for 29 years. Came back here 10 years ago to take over the MEP Center here. And the WCMP is one of the centers in the 51 Center Manufacturing Extension Partnership National Network, which every state has one of these centers that helps small and medium manufacturers stay competitive. And we're all affiliated with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And then we're all pretty free to help manufacturers the best way we see fit.
That's great. And by the way, when you cross the Cheddar Curtain, I don't think you need a passport, right?
Not yet. Apparently, we had a lot of you up here this past weekend with the restrictions lifted.
Yes, indeed. All right, well, why don't we move into a few things that you've been seeing the last few months. I know you've seen a lot of innovation and ingenuity along the way. Share with us what you've seen.
Well, what's been interesting is just how few manufacturers up here have actually ceased operations. We don't have any exact numbers, but we think it's somewhere between 65 and 75% of the manufacturers are still operating. And so that's it's been interesting as they've persevered and had to adapt on the fly to something that we're all still trying to learn how to deal with and how it reacts. I mean, we were talking a little bit ago about how the nature of the virus and our understanding of it keeps changing. And so therefore the reactions of people to keep their employees safe and make sure that their operations are still able to continue are also evolving. And by and large, the manufacturers have come through this pretty well. What's now a worry is that the backlog is starting to shrink. We're hoping that everybody goes out and buys a new car and everybody hops on an airplane so that those sectors can get up and operating again. But by and large, our manufacturers are ready to go.
Oh, that's great. And a couple of things. How are you seeing manufacturing different in different regions around the country, or are you?
Well, Wisconsin's one of the densest manufacturing states. So we are one of two states in the country where manufacturing is the largest part of our GSP. The other one is Indiana. And so we have an incredible appreciation for what manufacturing means to the economy. And I think in a lot of places, people have seen manufacturing as an afterthought. And that really is too bad, because as you've seen people work through the PPE crisis and the various steps of the coronavirus reaction, you can hear them say, well, we need to get testing in place and we need to get PPE to our frontline workers. And oh, by the way, just throw the switch on in manufacturing to get all that stuff happening, will you? And it's a little bit more complicated than that. And it's a bit of an afterthought. But I think we have a real opportunity here to reinforce the importance of manufacturing and making sure that we're looking at this strategically and not just from a short-term profit point of view.
Say more about that strategic direction, especially since there's been a lot of conversation about reshoring, onshoring.
Yeah, I think that we've taken the position that the market should decide in this country. And so that ultimately comes down to dollars and cents. And I don't think we've looked at it in a strategic way, much like some other countries have looked at it and said, these are the sectors that we need to actually have on our shore. And the most vivid example right now is with prescription drugs. I mean, much of the supply chain for that goes through Asia. And we have to ask ourselves whether that's where we want our future lying. Now, at the same time, if you look at some of the PPE that we've been talking about, take disposable gowns. There is one, before the crisis, there was one manufacturer of disposable gowns. And they were able to stay in business because they were domestic and they had invested in automating their line and bringing the best technology to bear. And the real dilemma becomes they can't really get up to scale unless they're able to amass orders. And so where other countries have taken the position of we want full factories and we're going to do what it takes to make sure that people are doing business with us, people on this side have left that decision to the purchasing department. And so, the decision becomes one of pennies rather than, is it really a good idea to have a supply chain that's 12,000 miles long? So I think we saw that for the first time after the tsunami, and everybody got concerned about having their supply chain in one place where it could be disruptive. We saw it again during the economic downturn, and we're seeing it now a third time with PPE and some of the medical supplies that we've been trying to get into this country.
It's such a complex issue, right? You talked about letting the free markets decide. You're also talking about small to medium-sized businesses figuring out how to scale appropriately, right? And also maybe increase in economies of scope as well. And then the supply chain efficiency, what you were also talking about, supply chain efficiency and how to navigate that as well. So as you're working with some of your constituents, how do you kind of prioritize some of this thinking so you can actually get tangible movement?
Yeah, what we're looking at right now, what we were working on very hard when the coronavirus hit was on productivity improvements. Because if you look at the demographics across the country, we really don't have a skills gap anymore. We have a body gap. And we just don't have enough people to continue growth long term. So if economic growth is the growth of the workforce plus the growth in productivity, we were relying on all our productivity coming out of, or all of our growth to come out of productivity. And in order to have even a 3% growth, we would need a 30% growth in productivity across a decade. And the problem is we haven't seen that level of productivity increase since the Second World War. So it's a real dilemma and something that we were really zeroed in on. And I think that's going to become an issue fairly quickly again, because I think as we come out of this downturn, it's not just going to be the number of bodies that are available, but it's actually going to be who's available. In fact, some of the top companies that we're dealing with right now are saying, geez, we have to double down on skill building right now and advancing our employees' career, because the folks that are on the unemployment line right now are not necessarily our first choices to come back into our manufacturing operations. So I think that's going to be the underlying trends haven't changed. I think the demographics are a big one. The advance of Industry 4.0 and the impacts of the cyber world are coming to bear. I think the demographic one has taken a pause while we're seeing this slowdown in the economy. But conversely, I think the technology one is picking up.
That's so interesting. I want to go back to a point you raised. I remember I was in a conversation with some folks actually out in Washington State, and we were having a conversation around resources and the human capital that you were talking about. And I know, Buckley, you focus on Wisconsin, but as you look nationally, you talked about we have enough bodies and we have enough upskills. But I would ask you to just explore a little bit. Do we have the bodies and the skills in the right places, right? Or does that matter?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Karen. It's a really interesting, I think, philosophical question, because as you're well aware, so much of the talent, the high base talent and the technology is based on the coast. I mean, when you start talking Boston, Seattle, and Silicon Valley, the rest of us get pretty sparse pretty fast. And, we're back to kind of a strategic and policy question. Do we let the markets dictate what happens again? And I'm a little bit concerned about that because, if the price of living in San Francisco or Seattle gets too high, where is that work going to move? There's no reason for it. There's no reason for it to come back to the Midwest over someplace like Singapore or another lower cost region that's high tech. And I think one of the things that I would add into the mix is, it's that manufacturing base that keeps things anchored.
Mm.
So I think there should be a real interest in rebuilding that manufacturing base in key advanced areas so that we hold on to those technological leads that have gone to the coast and feel like they're going offshore now. And I don't think that's where we want to be long term.
As we're starting to wrap up, I have two different questions for you. One is, it's based on your advice to one set of constituents around your small, medium, and even large manufacturers. What advice would you give them at this point in time as they look at the immediate, like how do we survive,
Right.
to long term, how do we thrive?
Right. We're seeing a couple of different groups of people. There's a substantial percentage of our manufacturers that are in trouble again.
Mm.
These are the smaller manufacturers. They haven't been upgrading their operations, and they're the ones who right now are just struggling to find the cash to make it through. Fortunately, that's a smaller subset of the group. For the rest of our folks, we're saying you better have a plan to be moving into Industry 4.0. Not necessarily because it's cool or it's changing your markets, but because it's going to make you more competitive and because you're going to need less labor. The second thing that I think is also changing is that every single organization is going to have to get larger. Before this, you've been able to run an operation at whatever level you were comfortable earning. If you're making a good living, you could run whatever size operation you wanted to run. Now you're going to have to get up to a certain scale. You're going to have to grow to a certain point because there are two things you're going to have to invest in. One is you're going to have to invest in Industry 4.0 to make yourself more competitive. But the second is you're also going to have to invest in cybersecurity because that's now a ubiquitous threat. And it's also existential. The numbers show that 60% of the companies that are breached don't exist in 2 years after the breach. So if you're not taking action to protect your company, and you're thinking that you won't be found, good luck. I mean, I would rather play roulette. The odds are better.
Wow. Hey, for our audience, since we have a broad-based audience, I know you live and breathe this. What defined manufacturing 4.0 for our audience sake?
Yeah, manufacturing 4.0 is the next phase, and I'm going to get them wrong, but the first one was was bringing manufacturing into a factory. The second one was applying the assembly line. That was manufacturing 2.0. Industry 3.0 was when we started computerizing. And now Industry 4.0 is bringing the physical and the cyber worlds together. A good example of that would be the way where jet engine manufacturers work, where they build a digital model of the actual engine, and they're able to predict performance on the model onto the actual engine so that then they can take action preventatively rather than reactively on the maintenance and the upkeep and performance of that engine. So that's just one example of hundreds.
All right, great, thank you. And back to the piece of advice, not to be political here, but just in terms of advice for our leaders, our government leaders, what would you say to them?
Well, I think we need to be looking at the whole. All of these decisions are interconnected, and just trying to make decisions that are correct right now based on philosophy isn't going to get us where we need to go. And we need to get people back to work. We need to get people back to work in ways that actually creates value for the country. And we need to think about the whole country and not just not just the coasts or the places that are easy to address. And I think by having an active philosophy about how you're doing this, and then going back to being an and culture, we've become a but culture. Karen, I really like your glasses, but they're square. As opposed to, hey, Karen, I really like your glasses and they're square. It's this thing about getting all that, putting everybody in a better place rather than saying, I win because you lose.
Yeah. Not the zero-sum game, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Expand the pie. Well, we really appreciate our time, Buckley. A lot of richness here. Certainly a macro view of manufacturing, making sure the return of manufacturing to the United States is a really important piece. Manufacturing 4.0, investing in infrastructure, being practical about it, and making sure cybersecurity is there. And then also really thinking about continuing to upskill, continuing that trend, and understanding that manufacturing is a very important grounding consideration for this country going forward, as well as the now.
Absolutely.
All right, terrific. Thanks so much, Buckley, for joining us.
Thank you, Karen. It was great fun. I appreciate it.